Hi everyone, welcome to our second webinar in preparation for our New York State focus groups for Powered to the Profession. This is a brief overview of the content of the new draft of the Professional Standards and Competencies for Early Childhood Educators. The purpose of this document is to set the standards on what completers of early childhood professional preparation program should know and be able to do. I encourage you to attend NAEYC's webinar on this draft on October 15th. Which may get into greater depth for each standard and also provide the reasoning behind the work group's decisions. For now, this is just a summary of what you'd see in the document. So today we're going to start with a welcome and introduction, then I'll walk you through the purpose of the document and the position statement itself. Next, we will talk about the current context that the document is situated in and the way the work group chose to structure it. We will go through each of the standards, the recommendations for implementing the standards across systems, and then talk about how you can help NAEYC refine the document. If you're joining me after our first NYAEYC webinar for grounding focus group participants, hi again. For new participants, my name is Katie Albitz, and I'm a consultant with NYAEYC and one of the people you will meet for the focus groups. My work with NYAEYC focuses on both Power to the Profession and our Get Out the Vote efforts and electoral advocacy. I'm also currently a member of NAEYC's Young Professionals Advisory Council, which means I'm one of about 15 young professionals across the country who has chosen to help guide NAEYC's decision-making and membership engagement of young professionals in the field of early education. And also, my background in the field in the profession itself comes from my experience as a preschool aide, toddler teacher, and in-home childcare provider. So what is the purpose of this document? It was created as a result of the Power to the Profession Task Force Decision Cycle 2, which determined that it would be the unifying set of competencies for early childhood educators. The purpose of the position statement is to support a sustained vision of excellence for early childhood educators. The position statement presents the essential body of knowledge, skills, dispositions, and practices required of all early childhood educators working with children from birth through age 8 across all early learning settings. This position statement will significantly influence the following: professional preparation programs, early childhood higher education accreditation and recognition, core knowledge and competencies, professional licensure and certification, professional training and development systems, professional evaluation and accountability, and it also provides a framework for aligning specific and critical policy structures. The position statement states, well-prepared early childhood educators are critical to realizing the early childhood profession's vision for every young child, birth through age 8, to have equitable access to high-quality learning and care environments. As such, there is a core body of knowledge, skills, values, and dispositions that all early childhood educators must demonstrate to effectively support the development, learning, and well-being of all young children. These are captured in the professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators later in this statement. These standards will be updated regularly to respond to new developments in the early childhood field, new research, and changing social and policy contexts. So what are those social and policy contexts, and how did the work group structure the document? First, this is a response to research and practice. So one of the key pieces of research is the 2015 Transforming the Workforce for Children Birth through Age 8, a Unifying Foundation report. This report informed the work group's understanding of young children and of the workforce that supports their learning and care. It confirmed the importance of high-quality early learning experiences for young children, confirmed that from birth, young children are actively developing across many domains, and help the public in the early childhood field better understand the neuroscience that drives young children's cognitive development, particularly during the child's earliest years. The document reflects the need for clarity and coherence. Currently, the early childhood workforce is fragmented across settings, credentials, and qualifications, compensation, and state standards. And the document is a comprehensive but not exhaustive list. These competencies can be expanded upon as needed to address specific state and local contexts to include more discrete competencies. It is aligned with the responsibilities of early childhood educators as defined in Power to the Profession. It is also aligned to in-task model core teaching standards for those working with the birth through 12th grade workforce continuum. It contains integrated content on diversity, equity, and inclusive practices and technology. They are not separate standards, but rather they are incorporated content areas across the context of each standard. And finally, the current draft does not include levels of the competencies, drawing distinctions between early childhood educators 1, 2, and 3 as established and empowered to the profession. Future drafts will contain these distinctions. So let's get into the standards. Standard 1. The first standard is child development and learning in context. Early childhood educators are grounded in an understanding of the developmental period of early childhood from birth through age 8 across developmental domains and understand each child as an individual with unique developmental variations. They understand that child development occurs within the context of families, cultures, languages, and communities. They understand that larger societal contexts and structural inequalities such as racism, sexism, classism, ableism, homophobia, and xenophobia impact young children's learning and development. They use this multidimensional knowledge to make evidence-based decisions to carry out their responsibilities. In this standard, early childhood educators are expected to meet the competencies of understanding the developmental period of early childhood from birth through age 8 across physical, cognitive, social, emotional, linguistic, and aesthetic domains. Understanding each child as an individual with unique developmental variations, agency, strengths, interests, challenges, approaches to learning, experiences, and abilities. Understanding the ways that child development and the learning process occur within multiple contexts, including family, culture, language, and community, as well as within a larger societal context of structural inequities. And using this multidimensional knowledge to make evidence-based decisions. Now, I'd encourage you to look at the document for each of these standards because they provide quite in-depth and lengthy descriptions of how each of these standards and competencies should be applied. So standard number 2 is family and community partnerships. Early childhood educators understand that successful early childhood education depends upon partnerships with children's families and communities. They know about, understand, and value the importance of and diversity in family and community characteristics. They use this understanding to create respectful, culturally and linguistically responsive, reciprocal relationships to engage families and communities in young children's development and learning. In this standard, early childhood educators are expected to meet the competencies of knowing about, understanding, and valuing the diversity of families and communities, knowing how to support and engage families and communities through respectful, reciprocal relationships, engaging as partners with families in young children's development and learning, engaging as partners with colleagues and communities in young children's development and learning. Standard 3 is child observation, documentation, and assessment. Early childhood educators understand that assessment, formal and informal, is conducted to inform instruction and planning in early learning settings. They understand that child observation, documentation, and other forms of assessment are central to the practice of all early childhood professionals. They know about and understand the purposes of assessment. They know how to use observation, documentation, and other appropriate assessment approaches and tools in a responsible way in partnership with families, professional colleagues, and children to document individual children's progress and to promote positive outcomes for each and every child. In this standard, early childhood educators are expected to meet the competencies of understanding the purposes of assessment in early childhood education, using observation, documentation, and other appropriate assessment tools and approaches, practicing responsible assessment that is developmentally, culturally, and linguistically appropriate to document developmental progress and promote positive outcomes for each child, practicing responsible assessment that is ethically grounded, and building assessment partnerships with families, professional colleagues, and children. Standard 4 is developmentally, culturally, and linguistically appropriate teaching practices. Early childhood educators understand that teaching and learning with young children is a complex enterprise, and its details vary depending on children's ages, characteristics, and the settings within which teaching and learning occur. They understand and use positive, supportive relationships and interactions as the foundation for their work with young children. They are knowledgeable about developmentally appropriate, culturally and linguistically relevant, universally designed materials and environments for early education. They understand that play is foundational to supporting children's learning and development. They use a broad repertoire of developmentally appropriate, culturally and linguistically relevant, and evidence-based teaching approaches that reflect universal design for learning principles. They develop and sustain reflective, responsive, and intentional practice. In this standard, early childhood educators are expected to meet the competencies of understanding positive, supportive relationships and interactions as the foundation of their work with young children, using knowledge of differentiated instruction in early learning settings, using a broad repertoire of developmentally appropriate, culturally and linguistically and evidence-based teaching approaches that reflect universal design for learning principles, and developing and sustaining reflective, responsive, and intentional practice. Standard 5 is content knowledge in early childhood curriculum. Early childhood educators use their knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, and common content knowledge to design, implement, and evaluate experiences which promote positive development and learning for every young child. They understand essential content knowledge and resources of early childhood education curriculum areas. They understand central concepts and inquiry tools in each content area and how young children learn and process information in the content areas. They apply their own knowledge of curriculum and content, curriculum content, and knowledge of what is meaningful to children and their families served to early learning standards and other resources, to spontaneous and planned teaching practices, and to curriculum development, implementation, and evaluation. In this standard, early childhood educators are expected to meet the following competencies: understanding essential content knowledge and resources, the central concepts, inquiry tools, and structures of the academic disciplines in an early education curriculum. Understanding pedagogical content knowledge, how children learn in each discipline, and how to effectively support young children's learning in each curriculum area. And the document here goes in depth about each area of curriculum and content knowledge. Applying content and pedagogical knowledge in the use of early learning standards and other resources, and decision-making during both planned and spontaneous teaching practices, and to curriculum development, implementation, and evaluation. And applying understanding of the connections and unifying concepts across concept areas to develop and implement integrated curriculum plans and to support children's integration of knowledge from multiple content areas to solve problems and explore their world. Lastly, Standard 6 is professionalism as an early educator. Early childhood educators identify and conduct themselves as members of the early childhood profession. They know and use ethical guidelines and other early childhood professional guidelines. They're continuous, collaborative learners who demonstrate knowledgeable, reflective, and critical perspectives on early childhood education to inform their practice. They are informed advocates for young children, families, and the early childhood profession. In this standard, the competencies expected of early educators are identifying and involving oneself with the early childhood field, knowing about and upholding ethical standards and other early childhood professional guidelines, engaging in continuous collaborative learning to inform practice, integrating knowledgeable and critical perspectives on early education, engaging in informed advocacy for young children, families, and the early childhood profession, engaging in ongoing proactive work to dismantle biases and prejudices within themselves, their program, and their community, and using strong communication skills to effectively support young children's learning and development and work with families and communities. So with this document, there are also recommendations for implementation across different levels of the early childhood education field and profession. These recommendations each have a description which provides reasoning and elaboration for how they should be implemented. I encourage you to read more in the document if one category is something in which you have particular expertise. So for the recommendations for professional preparation programs, these programs must align to these competencies and leveling. Programs should carefully consider which level of the early childhood educator they are preparing and ensure that level of mastery is aligned with the breadth and depth of competency mastery recommended in the Power to the Profession framework. Faculty must be qualified to teach candidates in the competencies. Faculty in early childhood teacher programs should have advanced graduate work and professional experience related to their teaching assignments. And standards, not standardization. Programs should be responsive to their local workforce needs, their community context, and their institution's mission. These standards are intended to provide a vision of excellence, not to constrict innovative responses to the needs of children, families, or current and prospective early childhood educators. Competencies in leveling should support transfer and articulation. General education courses must ensure that candidates gain the necessary content knowledge to meet expectations in Standard 5, as well as the skills needed to support candidates' demonstration of all standards. And finally, a commitment to advancing equity and diversity. Recommendations for higher education accreditation include ensuring programs are preparing candidates across and within competencies, ensuring that program design and infrastructure facilitate the candidate mastery of competencies, and ensuring that programs are aligned to the leveling in the position statement. For early learning programs, competencies should support early childhood educators' autonomy in early learning settings. They should ensure job candidates have completed the appropriate level of professional preparation needed for the early childhood educator positions. They should design and support professional development that advances educators' mastery of the competencies, and design and conduct evaluations aligned to the competencies. For federal, state, and local policies, they should support higher education as the core pathway for individuals to be prepared in the competencies. Policies and resources should intentionally minimize the impact of racism, elitism, and bias at all levels, and ensure that all individuals are provided with equitable opportunities to access and progress seamlessly through this core pathway. Align teacher licensure, certification, and credentialing to the competencies. Build professional development systems aligned to the competencies. Build professional development systems aligned to the competencies. All facets of the early childhood workforce should be aligned to and advance the competencies. And financing of the early childhood educator workforce should support higher education capacity building for preparing high quality educators. And recommendations for researchers. Create research agendas that examine the connections between the competencies and impact on young children's development and learning. Identify key features of preparation programs that effectively prepare candidates in the competencies. Inform the profession with new research on young children's development, educator quality, dimensions of effective teaching, etc., that should influence the next revision of the competencies. So where do you come in? How can you help provide feedback that will shape this document? First and foremost, it helps that if you could be prepared with comments and questions to share about the draft in our upcoming focus groups. No one expects you to be an expert in the draft that was just released, but if anything raises a question or comment in your mind, please bring it up in the focus groups. Next, I strongly encourage you to register for NAEYC's October 15th webinar on the professional standards and competencies, as well as sharing your thoughts in this survey. And the survey is linked in the PowerPoint, and it will also be linked in the description box on YouTube. If needed, feel free to reach out to me by email at kalbitz@newyorkaeyc.org. And thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you all in person for our focus groups. Thank you.